hard as that is, to develop, friendships with people that are really different from us, I think the next category is even more difficult, and that is maintaining relationships with people who we disagree with. I think one of the most exhausting and discouraging things over the last few years is it seems like we've just lost our ability to overcome our disagreements. And it is discouraging to see what political disagreements have done to families and to churches and to our community. And I know that it's like, that's always been a thing, but it just sort of seems like over the last few years that it's even worse. And it actually makes me even more appreciative of when I look at the Gospels and see what Jesus did with his disciples, and particularly how he chose his disciples. Think about this. As a rabbi, Jesus could choose whomever he wanted to be part of the group, to be his disciple. Those were personal invitations. And so there were 12 men who were officially his disciples. There was also a group of women that tended to be part of the group that sort of traveled around with him, and we're going to talk about them here in just a minute. And that group would have, over time, like each of those individuals, that group would have become their closest community. As they traveled together, as they ate together, as they went through hardships together, as they encouraged one another, as they lived life together, and as they did that over 3 years, and they became each person's closest circle. And as we look at the hand-picked group that Jesus created, as the seed of a community that was going to take over the world, consider who he chose. Now, there are some of the disciples that we don't know much about, but we know a little bit about some of them. We know that Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen, which in that culture, that would have been, they were just kind of day laborer types. We know that Matthew was a tax collector, so he was Jewish, who collected taxes for the Romans, for Rome. And the way that system worked is that for tax collectors, they could determine how much their salary or how much their income was going to be based upon how much they could extort from their own people, above and beyond what the tax burden actually was. And the Jews knew that about tax gatherers, and so they were considered traitors. There was also Simon the Zealot, who was a political activist, who was part of a movement that was dedicated to throwing off Roman rule and Roman oppression anywhere and however possible. There was also, as I mentioned, a group of women. If we read this in Luke 8, it says, "Soon afterward, Jesus began a tour of the nearby towns and villages, preaching and announcing the good news about the kingdom of God. He took his 12 disciples with him, along with some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Among them were Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's business manager, Susanna, and many others who were contributing from their own resources to support Jesus and his disciples." This is fascinating to me. So it seems like, similarly to the businesswoman Lydia in Philippi, who was instrumental in launching the church of Philippi and who helped finance Paul and his missionary journeys in the book of Acts, it seems like there were also some women of means who were bankrolling Jesus and his disciples in their sort of itinerant, ministry. This is a pretty diverse group. It sounds like the beginning of a joke. Like a rabbi, a tax collector, a zealot, and a rich woman go into a bar, and it's like, okay, what's the punchline going to be? It's like, this is going to be interesting. What do you think they talked about over dinner? I mean, there would have been women of means, along with kind of day laborer types, the fishermen. There was Joanna, the wife of Herod's business manager, and there was Matthew, who was a tax collector, and there was also Simon the Zealot. Jesus picked representatives of the most antagonistic groups in their culture. And depending upon where you are, it's possible that you can imagine in your mind people or maybe groups of people that you think are a little too extreme in their point of view or what they do. And that's certainly the way many of the disciples would have viewed Simon. There might be people, there might be individuals or groups that you think are selling out our country and are actually doing more harm than good. Certainly a lot of Jews and some of the disciples would have thought that about Joanna and Matthew, certainly. Or maybe there's groups that just their lifestyle is just so different from you. It's not that they're bad, it's just like they just have a very, very different life. It's so hard to understand them. I imagine that some of the women may have felt that about the fishermen. Or maybe there's groups that you feel like are a little too entitled or maybe have more money than they deserve. I mean, I say all of that to say I think we can assume that the disciples understood what it meant to disagree. When Jesus invited each person to follow him, one of the conditions to be a disciple was that you guys are going to have to follow me as a group. And Jesus knew they disagreed on stuff. And he knew those disagreements were over legitimate things. But if they couldn't work through their disagreements so as to be able to have meals together, to be able to travel together, to be able to support one another, to be able to do life together, then they couldn't be part of the group. They couldn't be a disciple. Think about that. If they couldn't follow Jesus arm in arm with people they disagreed with, then they couldn't follow Jesus at all. And certainly that is in keeping with the theology of what Jesus came to do, to break down barriers between people and people groups and to create just one group, but it's also instructive into the type of community that really sort of changes the world. He was building the ideal type of community. Obviously, there would have been friction, and we need it. In Proverbs, it says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, that there is a necessary element of friction that we all need to knock the rough edges off, to change us, to sort of mature us, to sharpen us, to help us grow up a little bit. And that requires, though, if the friction causes the relationship to dissolve, then the sharpening never is completed. So that then requires that we all have an assumption that the relationship is more important than my point of view. The person is more important than my perspective. Which means that some of us are going to have to be willing to forgive when we're offended. It means that others of us might need to tone it down just a little bit and make sure we're communicating that the person is more important than our perspective, right? It is easy to accuse other people of cancel culture while not admitting my own, sort of belligerent condescension toward anyone who disagrees with me, which communicates that my point of view is more important than the person. I think there's work to be done on all sides. As I thought about the action step that could be helpful for all of us to sort of move forward and sort of be able to link arms with people who we disagree with, honestly, as contentious as the last few years have been, the first thing that popped into my head is that some of us might need to reach out to certain individuals and just apologize. Some of us got a little carried away. And everyone just seemed locked and loaded, and ready for battle. And some of us did battle, and just left a wake of hurt feelings and damaged relationships, behind us. And others of us just sort of ghosted people. It's like, I don't need that kind of negativity, and we just sort of shut people off. And so, either way, it's just that's just not the right way to treat people. And as a pastor, I can tell you that I certainly felt, pressure on all sides. And we're a part of a diverse church, and it's hard to be sort of neutral all the time. But as I look back, as I was going through this, and as I look back over the last couple of years, I do see instances and relationships. I just see the way I responded to certain things that just, they weren't good. They weren't good. And so my to-do list from this message is as I was going through this and preparing, there are certain names coming into my mind of people that I need to reach out to, and I need to apologize to. Because regardless of my point of view, Jesus teaches me that people matter more. So that's my action step. So I want you to know that's like I'm not just saying you all do things. Like I have my own to-do list. Like I have one too. But maintaining relationship with people who we disagree with, I mean, it's just harder, right? Requires patience, requires forgiveness. It requires that we sort of temper our language and we don't just sort of bowl over people and say, we'll deal with it, or whatever. And we can kind of, work with people, like all of that kind of stuff. And it's just easier to just sort of drift away, or it's like all of that kind of stuff. And it's just harder, but it's worth it.